I'm Tracy Sabol. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, search and rescue. More than 2,000 people are dead following a massive earthquake in Morocco. How the world is responding. Race against time. Lawmakers address the humanitarian situation facing thousands of Christians in Armenia. We're on Capitol Hill. Somber anniversary. A look at the ceremonies on the 22nd anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And quite a correction. Pope Francis tells the faithful how to best point out someone else's faults. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, Americans are reflecting today on the anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Terrorists killed nearly 3,000 people when they crashed jets into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. President Joe Biden planned to mark the Day of Remembrance at a military base in Alaska after returning from an overseas trip. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
At the National September 11th Memorial in New York City, Vice President Kamala Harris joining other dignitaries remembering in silence. While at the Pentagon, where a giant American flag was unfurled, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin participated in a wreath-laying ceremony. He told those in attendance the men and women of the Department of Defense will always remember.
I'm especially moved to be here with the family members of those we lost, with the survivors of the attacks, and with the first responders who raced to save innocent lives.
And General Mark Milley said today we pay tribute
to the 2,977 innocent men, women, and children who lost their lives 22 years ago today at this very minute.
In Pennsylvania, at the Flight 93 National Memorial, Second Gentleman Douglas Emhoff met with family members who were on that plane. Passengers stormed the cockpit, crashing the plane into a rural field near Shanksville. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden coming back from a busy weekend overseas. He met today with the chairman of the National Assembly of Vietnam after earlier meeting with the country's president and prime minister.
We have an opportunity to strengthen alliances around the world to maintain stability. That's what this trip was all about.
While in Vietnam, President Biden also visited a memorial for the late Senator John McCain. And before traveling there, President Biden met with over a dozen world leaders at the G20 summit in India, where he announced plans to build a rail and shipping corridor linking India with the Middle East and Europe.
It's about creating jobs, increasing trade, strengthening supply chains, boosting connectivity.
The president expected to arrive at the White House late tonight. Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And joining us now is Christopher Bedford, executive editor of the Common Sense Society. Chris, good to be with you today, albeit a somber occasion. That said, as we mark the anniversary of 9/11, what are your reflections, Chris, on this day of 22 years after those horrific terrorist attacks?
No, it's important that we talk about this. It's important that we have these speeches. It's important that people read about this, know about this. I'm on the board of Young Americans for Freedom, where we've planted flags now for every one of the victims of the 9/11 attacks for decades on college campuses, on the National Mall. We're working on it today. And it's an important thing to do because, well, people my age remember this crystal clear. Well, my father was my age exactly on the day that 9/11 happened. Right now, there's not a single high school student in the country who was alive when that happened. And there are very few college students who are alive during this attack. And it's important to remember this. And there are signs that this is being forgotten. Well, YAFA's put out about 14 million flags over the years we've counted to commemorate this. Vandals have started attacking them at universities across the country. We've had flags pulled down called signs of imperialism as opposed to memories. We've had messages written in chalk to just remember the victims and to honor and to pray for these victims, erased by college students who think that that's somehow an awful message. So for teachers to be able to talk about this, for students to be able to talk about this, for us to be able to talk about this to our children is as important now as ever because our kids didn't live it like we did.
Yeah, and Chris, how do you think things have changed since that time? And do you think we're safer as a country today than we were back then?
Well, it's hard to say. So much has changed. The country's changed. The radical politics in the country have changed. The parties have grown further apart. I actually worry nowadays, where we saw, for example, an attack on a country concert in Las Vegas. There was such an outpouring of wickedness with people from the internet saying, who cares? It's a bunch of redneck country fans, assuming their politics, which is an impossible thing to do. I actually worry that if there was an attack on a Republican city or a liberal city in this country, would the country still come together like we did in 9/11? Would we all still join hands? Would we be willing to put aside our differences? We are divided. It's really important right now to remember the things that bring us together, those things that unite us. But there's been such a concerted effort, whether it's the flag or the anthem or religion, to destroy those symbols that unite us, that we're in trouble. Now, I don't think the threat from Islamic terror is what it once was in the United States. It's not what it was 10 years ago in the United States, but there's always still a threat, and more than any kind of external threat, the threat that's posed to America comes from in ourselves and what we're able to do, and if we're willing to put aside our politics to join with our neighbors again.
Yeah, so many people, are commemorating this day. President Joe Biden, though, he is really the first president not to attend a 9/11 memorial site in New York, Pennsylvania, or here in the D.C. area. What do you make of him, though, stopping over in Alaska to mark the occasion, rather than possibly, say, leaving the G20 earlier and finding himself at one of the other traditional locations?
Well, I think it's bad optics for sure. I think that it's another example of this White House team, often, which is a very young team in general, often forgetting the importance of these optics. I mean, President Barack Obama and President George W. Bush on occasion gave their remarks from the White House itself, or maybe visited with troops in some other area. For example, in Maryland, I think President Barack Obama went, as opposed to maybe in Pennsylvania or New York. But it was still in Washington, D.C., a city where you could see the Pentagon, you could see the smoke that day. I think it's fairly tone deaf for the president, or just an unforced error for him to be on his way back from traveling abroad on a day that's as momentous as this. But I mean, whether that will change many Americans' opinions on him one way or the other, I'm doubtful.
Chris, on that day, and so many of us remember it so well, the country really came together and became united as the United States of America. How do you think we can get back to that again?
We'd have to dispense with a lot of the divisive things that have been going on in this country. I mean, right now, I think there's a hard attack on the things that unite us from some left-wing activists that really don't want this country to be united. And I think while there's arguments and there's vitriol that goes from the right to the left and from the left to the right, those things that unite us, a shared history, shared heroes, a shared vision of a founding, a shared idea of a national border, a shared anthem, a shared flag, those things are fairly across the board being exclusively attacked from radical activists on the left. Sports has become politicized. All these different aspects of our lives have become politicized. Medicine, vaccines, whether you wear a mask, if your kid can go to school, all politicized and generally all coming from the same direction. Until that ends, until that's kind of that idea is rejected, and an America divided by race and sex is rejected by the people who are really pushing it, well, I'm not too hopeful for seeing that unity again anytime soon.
And Chris, thanks so much for coming on. We appreciate your insights as always.
Thank you.
More than 2,000 people are dead following a massive earthquake in Morocco. The 6.8 magnitude earthquake struck late Friday night. The UN estimates that around 300,000 people were affected. King Mohammed VI ordered 3 days of national mourning beginning Sunday. Search and rescue operations are underway. Well, President Joe Biden commented on the earthquake in a statement saying, quote, "My administration is in contact with Moroccan officials. We are working expeditiously to ensure American citizens in Morocco are safe and stand ready to provide any necessary assistance for the Moroccan people. The United States stands by Morocco and my friend King Mohammed VI at this difficult moment." Pope Francis also offered his prayers for those affected. And in Libya, the country's prime minister says he fears 2,000 people are dead after floodwaters swept through the eastern part of the country over the weekend. Officials say entire neighborhoods were swept away. The affected parts of the North African country have been declared disaster zones. The heavy rains came from a tropical storm that is set to hit Egypt next. Well, it is a race against time to prevent prevent genocide in a little-known area of the world. Some lawmakers are calling on the Biden administration to recognize that 120,000 Armenian Christians may soon face extinction. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with more on the effort to save those believers. It is a story that we have been following very closely here on EWTN News Nightly. Eric?
Well, good evening, Trace. You know, Congressman Chris Smith is the co-chair of the House's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. He held a hearing last week, and he says that thousands of Armenian Catholics have been sealed off from food and medicine and face starvation in a disputed area that Armenia and Azerbaijan have been fighting over for decades.
This horrible crime, this crime of genocide, was planned, tested, and imposed by the government of Azerbaijan, that it is to say by President Aliyev, who rules Azerbaijan with an iron fist as a dictator.
Since last December, the president of Azerbaijan has blocked the only road into Nagorno-Karabakh through the Lachin corridor. The United Nations reports that Armenians there face dire shortages of food, medical supplies, fuel, and more. Experts say the international community is to blame after failing to sanction individuals who committed crimes after previous wars.
Its message of failure sent a communication to the government of Azerbaijan that it can act with impunity and escape repercussions for its crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and acts of genocide.
In an August 30th editorial in the National Catholic Register, chairman of the board and chief executive officer of EWTN, Michael Warsaw, wrote about the immediate humanitarian concern caused by the inhumane blockage, writing in part, quote, "The Pope emphasized the need for the Church to accompany these nations in their current difficulties in communion with the other churches and Christian communities." Congressman Chris Smith agrees and warns genocide is likely unless the Biden administration takes action.
Please wake up, recognize the absolute grave responsibility it has here, and focus on finding and implementing a humane solution now. And this must mean that the blockade is lifted and the people continue to live in its ancient homeland.
Lawmakers have introduced several bipartisan measures in both the House and the Senate to end the blockade. I'll continue to follow this very important story. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including COVID and children. A Republican senator fights to ban masks in school, and why the Vatican is facing criticism from Ukraine. An attempt by a Republican senator to ban federal mask mandates at public schools has been shot down. Ohio Senator J.D. Vance was behind the Freedom to Breathe Act, which would have also banned mask mandates on domestic air travel and public transportation. But it was shot down almost immediately by Democrat Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who said the bill was a further sign of the GOP caring for gimmicks more than people. And to find out what is next for this measure, we go to Roger Severino, the Vice President of Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation, which supported Senator Vance's proposal. He is also the former director of the HHS Office for Civil Rights. Roger, great to see you again. So what more can you tell us about the Freedom to Breathe Act? And were you surprised that it was shot down so quickly? I mean, especially from all the studies and what we have learned since the pandemic.
It was a bit surprising. It just shows that there's a certain segment of the left in particular that is enamored of control. It's this totalitarian impulse that they're not willing to give up. They want to tell people what to do at all times, even when it flies in the face of the science. So we know now, and we knew actually for quite some time, that the efficacy of these mask mandates was just not there. It was not proven. Now we have the Cochrane study coming out of Great Britain that definitively shows that they really did not work. There were 12 controlled studies, randomized, which is the gold standard, that said there was no evidence that these actually did anything of significance. So Fauci was wrong all this time. We've known this. They based it on anecdotes, on hunches. You don't do massive social policy based on anecdotes. You do it on science, and the science is absolutely clear. The mask mandates didn't work. They should never come back, and that's what this bill was about.
Yeah, and I know you support, as we mentioned, this proposal from Senator Vance. And why do you say the masks harm children? I mean, tell us a little bit more about that.
Oh, yeah, it stunted so much of their social interactions and their development, especially at the early ages. The face-to-face contact is key to socialization and to learning. And you can't even hear people. My kids had to go through this. The muffled sounds of hearing teachers speak through a mask, and kids as well. And then the social distancing, and then the lockdowns. All of these things that were burdens placed on our children, who were the least vulnerable of all, right? They were the least vulnerable. It was the sick, the elderly, people who have pre-existing conditions. Those are the ones that needed the most protection. Yet we imposed this mask mandate on children, and the science wasn't there to back it up. We should never go again to punishing kids for doing nothing other than being kids.
Roger, what did Senator Markey say about this in his opposition?
It's hard to actually justify. I don't think there is a really good argument. I don't think it's a rational argument to say, look, we already made the mistake. Let's not repeat it. Let's make it into law. And we saw what happened with the mask mandates when it came to travel. The CDC said we needed masks when you go on an airplane, even though they're some of the best ventilation in the world is on an airplane. No, we needed mask mandates. Judge Catmuzzell struck it down, a Florida judge, and there is the natural experiment. Did the CDC say, look what happened, look at the disaster, because a judge said we can't have the mask mandates? To the contrary. There was no outbreak of COVID. We had the perfect experiment. The CDC was wrong. We have to learn from this to never repeat it, and that's why we need a law.
Do you think this is going to come up again, another effort like this?
Oh, I'm sure it will. Again, the impulse to control and to dictate is only growing. And now you're going to see national emergencies being declared for everything. We just saw a governor say that they're going to, I'm sorry, not a governor, a local official say we're not going to allow the Second Amendment to be in place during a public health emergency based on gun violence. So you want to suspend the Second Amendment based on gun violence? Again, it's this impulse to control that is never ending. It's a temptation that every government has, and our founders said we need checks and balances, and Congress should put that check. And if Congress doesn't do it, the court should do it as well.
What can we do, Roger? I mean, as just simple, citizens here, what can we do if we see these coming back again?
Well, speak up. Too many people rolled over and let their rights be trampled. They shut down churches, right? Your audience in particular should be very sensitive to that. They were telling you can't sing in church, and it was not based on science. We fought during the Trump administration to reverse some of the overreaching mandates on houses of worship. But not enough people stood up and said no. Not enough people sued. And many of the lawsuits actually won at the Supreme Court. But very few stood up for their rights. And when you don't stand up for your rights, you lose them.
And we're going to leave it right there. Roger, always great to be with you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, movie review, what a Colombian bishop says after watching the hit movie Sound of Freedom. Plus, Pope Francis tells the faithful what it takes to approach those who have wronged us. The Vatican has ordered an investigation into allegations regarding the possible mishandling of clergy sexual abuse cases in Switzerland. The Swiss Bishops' Conference said there are claims against several active and retired bishops. A full report is expected later this week. A Catholic bishop in Colombia is saying thank you to the producers of a recent movie. Bishop Miguel Gonzalez Moreno says Sound of Freedom is exposing the global problem of child sex trafficking. The church leader says the issue is particularly rampant in his country. He also says the movie producers were brave to shine light on a problem that others are ignoring. And one of the people who produced Sound of Freedom and was an actor in the movie has officially registered to run for president of Mexico. Eduardo Verastegui, whom we interviewed here on EWTN News Nightly, registered as an independent candidate. He made the announcement on X saying, quote, "It is a fact. Now is the time." The pro-life candidate says that he will be fighting for life and freedom. In the next few months, he will need to gather about 1 million signatures to support his candidacy. An advisor close to Ukraine's leader says Pope Francis should not be involved in trying to end the conflict, adding that the Holy Father is, quote, pro-Russian. In an interview on TV in Ukraine, the senior advisor also said that he thinks the Vatican is not credible on the topic, adding that he thinks Russia has investments in the Holy See Bank. Joining us now from Rome is Andreas Tannhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Andreas, great to see you. So why is Pope Francis accused of taking a pro-Russian stance?
So, Tracy, Pope Francis has always been an ally to the people in Ukraine. Last week, we spoke about the Synod of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is being currently held here in Rome, with more than 40 bishops who are in communion with the Holy See. And during their meeting last week with Pope Francis, they also addressed this very issue. And you're aware of the background, of course, because at the end of August, Pope Francis sent a message to Russian youth who were not able to attend World Youth Day in Lisbon because of the war. There he mentioned Tsar Peter the Great and Empress Catherine the Great as historical Russian figures for the young to aspire to. Later, on his flight back from Mongolia, Pope Francis clarified that he only was speaking of the great Russian culture and not of imperialist aspirations. That was one of the allegations the Holy Father had to face after his address of the young Russian Catholics.
And Andreas, I understand now President Zelensky's advisor has not only called him, quote, a pro-Russian pope, but also says that the Vatican shouldn't even be involved in peace efforts?
Yes, so Mr. Podolyak, this is the name of the presidential advisor, said in an interview on Friday that Pope Francis would be too favorable towards Russia in order to be taken seriously to play a mediating role in the Russian war against Ukraine. But he didn't stop there. He also suggested that the so-called pro-Russian stance would possibly be coming from payments the Vatican Bank, IOR, would be receiving from Russia. In a communique that was issued Saturday, just this Saturday, the bank, of course, rejected these allegations and clarified that no such payments were received or that Russian money would be under management by the Vatican Bank. In fact, this would be impossible even by regulation standards. All of this just shows how difficult the balancing act of the Holy See really is when it comes to brokering peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, because there are many different agendas regarding this topic, and so far only Hungary and the Vatican have come out as countries calling for an immediate ceasefire regardless of national borders. Pope Francis has tried to make it clear to both sides that he is primarily interested in peace, but not all political players like that message, at least so it seems.
And Andreas, I also understand that the Holy Father addressed this yesterday. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so at the traditional Angelus prayer on St. Peter's Square, he was addressing exactly this when he also invited everybody and was praying himself for those suffering in Ukraine. He also mentioned the example of the Ulma family, which was beatified in Poland just yesterday. The parents and 7 children of that family were martyred by the Nazis in 1944 because they were hiding Jewish refugees in their home. Pope Francis said they would show us how to use acts of charity to counter violence. But the family also used prayer in a special way, he said. And he said, let us intensify our prayers for those tormented in Ukraine.
Andreas, thank you so much for that report. We appreciate it. Andreas Tannhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Thank you again. Finally tonight, Pope Francis reminds the faithful that fraternal correction is an expression of great love.
Vediamo che Gesù cambia il suo atteggiamento.
At a Sunday address at the Vatican, the Holy Father underlined how to talk with someone who has wronged us, saying it takes, quote, real courage to do so. The Pope also condemned gossip, saying it is never good to talk behind someone's back rather than approaching them directly. Oh, we thank you for watching tonight. And remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. We leave you tonight with images from the 9/11 ceremonies. I'm Tracy Sabol. Good night and God bless.